buzzing through the walls, making their honey and singing their song. They say I worked for the queen all day. Yeah, I worked for the queen all day.
Hello, the Queen Bees. Hi, it's me, Angela, back with another first take on Chapter 12, Erstwhile Companions. I am going to make a very, very strong effort to keep these under 30 minutes based on feedback from you guys and my own deadlines with this book. This chapter will be a huge challenge to me because I have so much I would love to say about our second Willie chapter in this book. So we'll see how it goes. So, wow, this chapter had a bit of a twist I didn't expect. Actually, a couple of twists, a couple of revelations. The biggest bombshell being that John Cinnamon dropping this grenade on Willie with Minogue in total encouragement and agreement that he is Lord John's natural son. Did you notice that Diana has kept us on the ridge in this kind of like pastoral, warm, fuzzy vibe for all the chapters so far, except for the two isolated Willie chapters. They're the only two that have not been on the ridge. And those are like shoved kind of very isolated. Like one was chapter 6 or 7, and now we have this one at chapter 12. They're kind of like sporadically thrown in. And both of them come in out of nowhere and drop these huge shockers on poor Willie. In the first one, you have Randall saying that Richardson is an American agent and that he's threatening to expose John as a sodomite, and that he pulled Bates's legs at the gallows, leaving William just totally stunned. And then we have more pastoral stuff on the ridge, and now boom, this. Lord John apparently has a natural son that he never spoke a word to Willie about. And like, I'm thinking these are the metaphoric snake dropping out of the tree on your head chapters that we saw Diana referenced when she did her snake description. She kind of was talking about it, and then sometimes the snake just falls out of the tree on your head. This kind of reminds me of those chapters, these Willie chapters, where things are just dropped on him out of the clear blue. So it's like you're all cozy on the ridge, you know, you're making cookies, you know, in the ridge life, blessing hearts, reading Dr. Seuss, looking at church sites, even if they're burnt still, you know. And then the snake falls on your head, or Willie's head, you know, and pulling another rug out from under him. So, it's like, you know, the other thing is, wow, Diana said, she said to read the Lord John books while you wait for bees. And she was not kidding. Look at how much was referenced from that series in just these two first Willie chapters. Just two. And we've already seen, and I'm sure there's more to come, we've already seen Michael Bates mentioned in the last one, and now we have John Cinnamon and Minogue with this whole bomb, you know, that's going off. And I've stayed off a lot of social media as far as like people talking about bees and stuff. But I can imagine that the reaction to this chapter of those who have read Lord John before is very different from those that have not read Lord John before. I imagine those that have not are either A, completely confused and have no idea what the hell's going on, B, pissed off at DG for doing this, you know, or C, completely freaked out at hearing the news, you know, like they can't even believe what the hell's going on, you know what I mean? One of those three, the reaction is, you know, I can imagine, because you wouldn't know, if you didn't read, you would not know that this was all not true. So while the Lord John readers know the real story, and why Cinnamon might think this, they are kind of still, at least I was, I'll speak for myself, I was still kind of surprised that he doesn't know that John was just his benefactor, that he's under this impression that John is his actual father. And I'm even more surprised that Minogue actually thinks that. And I feel like the horror of poor William here and dread watching this whole misunderstanding unfold. Also, I feel a little sad for John Cinnamon, who seems like a really sweet and gentle giant type almost, is kind of how he seems. He seems like this real, not overly aggressive guy, at all. Just this guy, probably desperate to meet his father, this little orphan kid. And he doesn't come across as having any kind of like nefarious intentions involved or trying to get his money or any of that kind of stuff. I think he just wants to meet his father. And he is in for a huge disappointment that Lord John is not his father. He should be so lucky to have Lord John as his father. So I promised Jen, she's one of my friends here that's one of our patrons, and she might not be the only Lord John virgin listening to this, that if something like this came about, I would give some backstory for those that haven't read Lord John, and when these things come up, to help explain it. So let me do that real quick. I'll give you the 411 on the background. Most of you know this, but I will run it by you anyway. So both of these characters, John Cinnamon and Minoke, are featured in the Lord John novella Custom of the Army, which Diana wrote at the same time that she wrote Echo in the Bone. It's also where we first meet General Fraser of Balnain, whose body Jamie took back to Scotland, became William's commander on the field. Remember, he told Willie he knew his father, Lord John, from the Battle of Quebec. So we meet him also in Custom of the Army. It's an excellent story. Anyway, so in that story, Hal sends John to Canada in 1759 to get him out of London for a while and support the army there while helping a court-martialed friend that asked for him. I'm not going to get into all that. John's cousin Olivia, who was a ward of the Greys, but also their cousin, they loved her very much, married Malcolm Stubbs, an officer in the army with the Greys. This marriage happened to be arranged by John himself while Hal was away on campaign. So he feels very responsible for Olivia, which is the cousin's name, Olivia, and this marriage, and he was the one that put it together and all of that kind of stuff. John and Percy actually emergency delivered Malcolm and Olivia's baby, in this situation that came up. So Cromwell, his name is, in the Brotherhood of the Blade. And that story takes place before Custom of the Army. Okay, so when John was heading out to embark to Canada, Olivia had given John a miniature portrait of the baby to give to Malcolm, who was stationed as well in Canada, who has never seen his child, Cromwell. Okay, when he gets to Canada with this precious thing that Olivia gave him for her husband, when John locates Malcolm's whereabouts, he finds that he's shacking up with this half Indian, half French woman, and had a baby with this woman. And so, and the baby is for sure Malcolm Stubbs's, because he has the same curly, cinnamon colored hair like Malcolm has. And so, John is furious. I mean, furious. He's probably the most furious I've ever seen him in any of the books, as far as where he just loses it. He's so upset and pissed off, like angry, pissed off. Now, he made their match. He loves his cousin. He tracks Malcolm down and gives him a major ass kicking. It was awesome. It was awesome. Anyway, how dare you do this? How dare you do this? He was freaking out. And he shoves the miniature of Cromwell, Olivia's son, in his face. And he's like, here's your other son, and everything. And so Malcolm gives him this whole sob story about how the difficulty of army life. And then he's wounded in Quebec and nearly dies. And he has little interest in what's going to happen to this child. He ends up sent home, leaving John to pick up the pieces of this little family that he really is already upset about. So when he goes to the family, it turns out that an illness had swept through this little village and it killed the mother. And the grandmother doesn't really want to deal with this child on her own. So Lord John buys the child from the grandmother and then goes to Minoke, who had become his lover during this trip, and had more connection to the locals and all of the things that are in the area, who helps him relocate this baby into a French mission. The priest agrees to take the boy and to raise him. In return, Lord John will send money annually for his support, and the priest will send him a lock of the child's cinnamon colored hair every year to assure John of his health and well being. So he doesn't know the child's name. So when the priest asks, he says his name is Cinnamon for his hair, right? And then feeling kind of, at that point, he was feeling kind of melancholy. He had kind of bonded with this little boy in dealing with him and trying to get him settled. And so thought, I'm never going to have a son of my own. I'm never going to end up having something to pass of myself in the world and so forth. And so he gave him his own first name. And then John, after kind of debating whether or not to say anything about this whole entire thing, ended up just quietly paying his support throughout his childhood and life. He just basically did it, never said nothing to Olivia, never said nothing to anybody, kept the secret. So he never told anybody, and Malcolm Stubbs never showed interest in this child. Actually, told John in a later story in Besieged, when he crosses paths with Malcolm Stubbs again, and John kind of asked, to just see what he would say. What happened to the woman and the child in Canada? Malcolm said that the other child and the Indian woman died from fever. That both the child and the mother died of fever, because he doesn't want to admit to John that he abandoned him, which pissed John off all over again internally, but he kept his mouth shut. He just kind of was like, you bastard, in his mind. So then many years later, William encounters John Cinnamon, who's around his own age, when he is stuck through the winter in Quebec after Dennis abandoned him up in Quebec. Remember that in Echo in the Bone. And John Cinnamon served as his guide over that entire winter and helping him. They went hunting. They kind of got to be friends. And in the chapter called Joy Noel, when William is writing back his father from prison, he talks about this guy that he met with curly cinnamon hair, and that told him stories about the stars or something like this. But this is the first time in this chapter that we are actually meeting John Cinnamon as an adult. We only saw him as a baby before. So I just never expect. So I know the whole story of him. I know he's not Lord John's child. I know why he might think that if he found out this guy was paying his support all his life. I just never expected that he was told that John was his actual father. But I mean, it does make sense that, it doesn't not make sense or anything. What else would the priest think if he didn't know any better? If he didn't know any better, he wouldn't think some stranger just going to pay him all his life for this child. But I'm surprised that Minogue didn't know better. I'm surprised that he didn't know the truth. He knows John likes men. He's one of the men John likes. And he was around when all of this happened. There was no conversation that occurred that said, where, John clarified this isn't his baby. He's just getting taken care of, like whatever. But John is a type that doesn't really say anything he doesn't have to say. So maybe John never explained where the child came from, and just that he's responsible for him and needs to see him cared for. And then Minogue took that at face value, figuring, maybe he goes both ways on occasion or something, and ended up leaving this girl with child, but and now it's an orphan, but can't take it home, would be a scandal. Like one of those things like with Hal and John where it's not talked about, type of thing. So I guess that's what happened. So let me share a few other thoughts on this chapter. We're in Willie's POV, and he is out Mount Josiah, and he's looking for some alone time in a place that he knows is his, that he always felt safe and happy, the last place that he always remembered joy in his life, and he wants to go there just to kind of think and work through some stuff about what to do next on his quest for Ben, and what he's going to do next on his personal front, in his life. He's in his majority now. He has to kind of make decisions about what to do with his assets, what he's going to do with his title. The first thing, though, that really surprised me was how dilapidated this house was that William and John lived in from when William was 12 to when he was 16. This was only 5 years ago. This isn't like eons ago. And when John was there, John's not going to like leave it like a shithole, like he's going to be making improvements. He even wrote to Jamie about improvements he was making and things they were fixing and doing. Also, he would feel like a responsibility because he had care of this property in William's name. He's going to want to keep it for William to have a valuable investment when he becomes of age. So why is it all run down? I don't understand that. It kind of really surprised me. It surprised me so much that I did a search to see if Diana had talked about it, because I'm sure I wasn't the only person that said what's the story with this. So I did find a quote from her. She said, Mount Josiah has never been anything but a rather small working plantation. In an earlier book, Lord John describes it in a letter to Jamie, remarking about waking up in the morning with chickens roosting at the foot of his bed and the holes of the roof letting in the rain. And she says, I mean, why would anyone have a grand house on a tobacco farm in the boonies of Virginia, let alone leave it staffed with servants, even people who owned large London houses for the season, but lived most of the time in their country estate, would close up the London house, furloughing the staff and leaving the furniture shrouded in dust covers. So, okay, I guess, but still, I can't imagine Lord John living there with Willie for 4 years, steadily improving the property, straightening it out for an eventual thing William would inherit, and then leaving it in such a state to just get more and more dilapidated, to the point that it's this dilapidated in 5 years. 5 years isn't that long for a house to just sit. So that was a little bit for me like, that seems a little much, and I'm not sure why she made it so dilapidated. Maybe it's to just kind of say this is the one thing like William rightfully owns, but look at the state it's in. I don't really know. So he gets there and he approaches and he smells smoke of cooking, and he realizes that people are there, and so he's ready to deal with any squatters. And I kind of like the way he thinks, this is my place, if they think they're just going to squat on my place, which I kind of loved. And then he sees John Cinnamon, this big Indian, dressing a pig, and he's kind of stunned. And they both are kind of stunned because they're both not expecting to see each other in this place, even though they do recognize each other. Also note how Willie correct that John Cinnamon calls him Lord Ellesmere, and William corrects him to say William Ransom, like basically like tossing off the title, which is kind of the exact opposite of the last chapter with Willie when he was clinging to that title in the chapter with Denny's to kind of get him out of this mess. So I kind of thought that was kind of funny. Then Minogue pops up. Now this is the first we've seen Minogue in the flesh in the big books. And the first we've seen William with him interacting. And I really enjoyed seeing this reaction. He said, Minogue, then shouted, Minogue! And the older man looked up, and the older Indian's face lighted with joy. A sudden, uncomplicated happiness washed through William's heart, cleansing as the spring rain. And then they give each other a hug, and Minogue is like, you've grown, boy. And you see all this warmth between them, and then you see Willie's memories of time at Mount Josiah with his father's friend Minogue. They must have been really discreet. I mean, John and Minogue must have been very discreet about their little, grumpy pumpy actions going on, because, Willie is completely clueless about it. And we hear a little bit in William's POV about what Minogue was to Mount Josiah and his memories of him and all of that. So Minogue apparently remained in Cinnamon's sphere of interaction, keeping an eye on him, and they became somewhat friends. And while he and Cinnamon are speaking in rapid French, William's thoughts wander to he sees the chickens, and he hears chickens, and it makes him think of a chicken encounter with Rachel, and we get like a full flashback to that scene. So he doesn't seem quite over her yet. Minogue asks if he's staying. If so, can he fix the chimney? And so he thinks on it, and while Minogue and Cinnamon are now talking in intense Algonquian, and this chapter really has like a lot of great introspection for Willie that I can't deep dive into, but I can't wait to do it when we do our deep dive. I'm just hitting the highlights here. And his thoughts wander to Ben. and then to Ian and Rachel, and then to Jane, and which takes him then to Jamie, which is really interesting. Right before this whole revelation comes to him, that he comes down to this little thought process in his head, and I loved his thought process here because it really shows his progress. It was one of my favorite parts of the chapter. Jane, his mind shied away from his last sight of Jane, that couldn't be fixed either, nor erased from his memory. Jane was a small, hard pebble that rattled sometimes in the chamber of his heart. Nor could the thousand-spiked fact of William's true paternity be fixed, brought face to face with Jamie Fraser, having spent a hellish night with him in the futile hopes of rescuing Jane. There was no possible way to deny the truth. He'd been sired by a Jacobite traitor, a Scottish criminal, a goddamn groom, for God's sake. But you've a claim to my help for any venture you deem worthy, the Scot said. And Fraser had given him that help, hadn't he? At once and without question, not only for Jane, but for her little sister Frances. William had barely been able to speak when they buried Jane. Remembered grief clutched him now, and he bent his head over the half-eaten chunk of fish in his hand. William had just thrust little Frances into his Fraser's arms and walked off. And now, for the first time, he wondered why had he done that. Lord John had been there too, attending the sad, tiny funeral. His own father thinks that way right before this. His own father. He certainly could have given Franny safely into Lord John's keeping, but he hadn't. Hadn't even thought of it. No, I'm not sorry. The words echoed in his ear, and the touch of the big warm hand cupped his cheek just for an instant. An overlooked fish bone caught in his throat, and he choked again. Oh my goodness. So we're getting there, folks. We're getting there. You know, he's kind of coming around. You can see it in that little thought. He gets up for water. Thinks he'll have to figure out what he's going to do with the Ellesmere estate. But maybe he'll stay here for a while first to sort through stuff. And he heads back feeling calmer just minutes after thinking about his own paternity, his own father. He comes back to see an embarrassed Cinnamon and an intense Minook saying Cinnamon has something to say, and urging Cinnamon, go on, you have to tell him sometime, now's a good time. So confused, curious, William encourages him, and Cinnamon says that he came here looking for Lord John, his father. Holy moly. Oh my God, poor William. He's just been getting pummeled with news, William. He's stunned. He looks at Minook, and who just nods, glad all the cards are on the table. You know, he's like, no biggie. And William is just spitting, and he holds himself kind of numbly together and says, I congratulate you. And Diana does a fantastic job in this chapter, describing Willie's utter interior shock at everything, and then feeling he should say something. He says, Lord John is a good man. And poor Cinnamon is beside himself, not knowing what to say, looking like he wants to crawl in a hole. And Minook, who I loved in Custom of the Army, he has that same blasé attitude that he had in Custom of the Army, oblivious to all the repercussions of all this, you know, and he has this whole attitude like, see, no biggie. That wasn't hard, was it? That's the kind of look on his face. So William has got some serious daddy issues on both sides now, and he keeps taking glances at Cinnamon, looking for any trace of John, seeing no trace of John. Cinnamon gets up, tends the fire, and William looks down, embarrassed, like his hand was caught in the cookie jar, you know. And then he thought he saw something in the eye sheet, maybe of Papa, and then he thinks, and he stopped cold, unable to finish a thought that had the word Papa in conjunction with this. The thought of it was a blow in the pit of his stomach every time. Son. Lord John's son. It was bloody impossible, but there it is nonetheless. Minoki never lied, nor was he a man to be easily gulled. Neither would he ever do anything that might damage Lord John. William was sure of that. So he's really torn over this. He can't imagine this is true. And it doesn't make any sense. And underneath of all that, he's hurt. Loses here he is. He's now again losing a sense of belonging and trust. His hopes for solitude, they're out of the question. And then we read this, which really broke my heart for William. He says, John Cinnamon's revelation had paid altogether the notion of retreat. He could walk as far as he liked. He couldn't escape the reality of the man, big and solid and Indian, and the thought He's Papa's real son, and I'm not. The fact that William had no blood relationship at all to John Grey had never seemed important to either of them until now. Ugh, oh my goodness. So he tries to think if Lord John had had a casual encounter with an Indian woman, it was nobody else's business. If the mother died, it would be plausible that Lord John would want to see to the child's care. He's trying to talk himself around. And then he thinks, and just what will Papa do when he sees this fruit of his whoremongering ways? And you have to almost laugh because you think, oh my God, it's such a wrong impression. And he thinks that was too much. He stood up and walked away. He just wanted a piss and a moment of privacy to settle his mind. But his mind didn't want to settle. He kept walking, though darkness was falling. So he goes to the barn. He sees the tobacco drying in the barn, and he thinks that someone must be working the land. And we get this mention of a big neighboring plantation that John had occasionally made arrangements for, named Bob White. And so I don't know if that's relevant for later or not. It just felt tossed in, so I kind of want to mention it in case it becomes important. He had made up his mind to avoid the issue about his paternity, his title, his responsibilities, the goddamn shape of his rest of his life, and now Lord flicking John bloody effing son has caused it instead to squirm off in another direction, latching onto the problem of Ben. So now he starts to think about Ben, and he thinks whoever buried the body knows what happened. And so now we find out that William has talked to 23 militiamen, which is impressive, over the last 4 months. And 4 of them had heard of Ben and that he was dead, but none of them had seen the body. He senses they were honest. So he wishes that he had seen the message that was sent to Uncle Hal. And he chastises himself for not asking the person's name. And then you get a couple of these couple lines, which I think really shows William's growth and self-awareness. He says, "Why the bloody hell didn't you ask to see it?" he muttered to himself. "Because you're too busy being on your high horse about your damn dignity," his mind replied. And that was the logical next thing to do, though. Find some of the American officer who wrote the letter and then find the officer. It feels very much like the way Jamie self-talks when he knows that he acted too prideful about something and he's trying to be honest with himself. So he determines that must be his next step. Go to Savannah, see Hal, look at the letter, see what he can figure out. And he comes back to the fire again with some plan of action, and he gets hit again. And I have to say, I was really proud of William again here. He showed a lot of maturity, I thought, after being hit like this. And Minogue says, "Do you know where he is?" he asked directly. "Our Englishman?" Our Englishman, forsooth, William thought, and glanced at Cinnamon. The Indian's head was bent, absorbed in stuffing his pipe, but William thought he could see a certain stiffening of the big shoulders. "No," William said, but honesty compelled him to add, "The last time I saw him, he was with the army in Savannah. That's in Georgia." And so then Cinnamon said, "How far is that?" "Maybe 400 miles, William hazarded. If he said no more, presumably Cinnamon would set off for Georgia, leaving William to find what peace he could here. And then he thinks maybe I could send a letter with him. But then he says, and let Papa meet this fellow without warning? He was honest enough to admit that his disinclination to allow this had nothing to do with his potential embarrassment to Lord John or inconvenience to Cinnamon, but was a mixture of curiosity and, well, simple jealousy. If Lord John was going to meet his natural son as a grown man, he, William, wanted to be there to witness the meeting. "The army moves a lot, you know," he said at last, and Manicky smiled at him. What do you think the smile meant? Manicky knew what decision he would make? Do you think that's what it was about? Cinnamon made a soft sound of acknowledgement and bobbed his head, though he kept his eyes fixed on the beaded tobacco pouch on his knee. "Do you want me to take it to him?" William asked, his voice a little louder than he intended it to be, "to Lord John." Cinnamon lifted his head startled and looked at William for a long, inscrutable moment. "Yes," he said at last, softly, then bending his head again. "Thank you." Well, what the devil, William thought, taking the pipe Manicky offered him. "I can think on the way." That sounded so much like Lord John, that last little statement. So for me, knowing the story, I feel bad for all three. My heart goes out to all three. Cinnamon, because his real father can't hold a candle to John and really did abandon him and wrote him off as dead. William, for having yet another blow to him, after what happened with Dennis, it must feel like everything he thought he knew about Lord John is now tainted and unreliable. And now he has 400 miles to stew on this. And for me, Lord John, who has no clue what's about to hit him, you know, he struggled with what to say on all this before when it actually happened, and now it will be a struggle again. And when Cinnamon and Willie just sit there and show up on his doorstep and confront him with this, you know. But in spite of all that, I know the truth. But if I hadn't read Lord John and I didn't know the truth, I would be in a whole different place at the end of this chapter, you know. But I was really proud of William. I think he's growing up. So they're off to Savannah, John, Cinnamon, and William. And from what we read in Daily Lines, they seem to be a real support for each other and very close. So I'm looking forward to seeing that relationship evolve. I really like Cinnamon. He kind of seems like a new, unique vibe character in the Gabaldon universe. So share your thoughts below. What did you think of this chapter? Were you surprised that Cinnamon thought this? What did you think of these three characters and how they all handled the encounter? And how do you think John will react? Oh God, please in heaven, please let Hal be there when all of this goes down. I really need to see his reaction to all this. Be back soon with chapter 13. What is not good for the swarm is not good for the bee. Ciao.